In this video, we're going to look at the different properties of water that develop. And these properties develop because we've already talked about water is a polar molecule, and it can form hydrogen bonds with itself and with other molecules. And the hydrogen bonding can give water these unique properties that we don't see in other substances. So if I ask you to name a property of water, then you're going to have to say things like cohesion, adhesion, capillary action, etc. So let's go through these and make sure you have an understanding of what those properties are about. Whenever you have two similar molecules being attracted to one another, then we say that's called cohesion. So the attractive force between similar molecules is cohesion, and we know water is attracted to other water molecules because the partial charges are attracted to each other. Now, water can also form an attraction or a hydrogen bond between other polar molecules. So let's put another or a different polar molecule right here. And there's lots of polar molecules in plants like cellulose, starch. Water is attracted to those molecules. And so when you have two different molecules and an attractive force between them, we don't call that cohesion, we call it adhesion. Now let's take a look at capillary action, and I'm going to draw kind of the other side of a tube in our picture here. Because of cohesion and adhesion, water has the ability to move upward, like in glass tubes or in the xylem, which are basically tubes where water flows up in plants. Water has the ability to move upward in plants, and that's because of cohesion and adhesion. So when you see these two water molecules being attracted to one another, okay, that's a hydrogen bond, so we can see cohesion is happening. And then we also see right here some adhesion. So you can see how water is being attracted to this molecule over here. So that would be some adhesion right there. Let's put adhesion. Now, if this water molecule gets pulled upward, let's say it's attracted to this side over here, and so it kind of moves upward and forms a bond with this molecule that we have over here, or the glass, if this was a glass tube. If this water molecule goes up, then it's going to pull other ones with it. So capillary action, again, is the movement against gravity due to cohesion and adhesion. And so that's why water is able to move up in plants from the roots to the leaves. Now, I've kind of neglected this column over here. So on your first assessment, you need to be able to tell me properties of water. You should be able to define them, recognize them if I show some kind of image related to the property. You need to tell me how that property is important to living things. So these first three all can be related to plants and allowing plants to take in water and transport it from your roots to the leaves. So when one water molecule goes into root cells, other water molecules are pulled in. So that's some cohesion. The water is attracted to those molecules of the plant. That's why the water goes into the plant cells and the roots in the first place. And when one water molecule goes in, other ones come along. So plants are able to take in water molecules because these molecules that make up the plant, water is attracted to them, so there's adhesion. And when those both are taking place and water is moving through the thin columns up a stem, we say capillary action is happening. So all these relate to plants taking in water in the roots and transporting that water upward through the stem and to the leaves. Now, another thing about water is water can participate in reactions. So you could say that it's reactive, and sometimes in some processes water can be a reactant. Sometimes water is a product in a reaction. So water participates in reactions. I'm going to change this equal sign to look more like an arrow because that's usually how we write a reaction. And then you just need to know that anything that's on this side of the arrow is a reactant. then whatever is on this side of the arrow is the product. So this means glucose and oxygen is getting made into CO2, water, and ATP. Another thing about water that we know is water is good at dissolving molecules. It can dissolve other polar molecules. Remember, polar molecules will interact with other polar molecules. And water can also dissolve those ionic compounds. If you remember, salt wouldn't dissolve in vegetable oil, despite vegetable oil being a liquid, because salt is an ionic compound, and it can only be dissolved in a polar solvent, something like water. So since water is so good at dissolving molecules, it can dissolve polar molecules and ionic compounds, we call it the universal solvent. All right, now how this relates to living things is for reactions to happen, like for example, these reactions up here, you have to have the reactants have to be dissolved in water. CO2 has to be dissolved in water in plants. And if that's the case, then light energy can convert the CO2 in the water into glucose. In your body, when you go to make ATP, the glucose is dissolved in your blood. The oxygen is dissolved in your blood. So it's important that molecules can be dissolved because those molecules must be dissolved before they can participate in reactions. So water dissolves molecules needed for reactions in the body. Without water dissolving those molecules, then they wouldn't be able to come together and react to form different products. Something else that's unique to water. Water is the only substance that becomes less dense when it's a solid. So here's water molecules, and you see they're more spread out. This is what water molecules would look like in ice. Versus whenever you have liquid water, you can see that they're closer together. They're more dense. So as a result, when you have ice and you have liquid water, the ice will float on top of the liquid. Water is the only substance that does this. All other substances are more dense when they're a solid. Now, because water is less dense and it can float, then it can prevent lakes from freezing solid from the bottom up. And so therefore, if you have ice on top and then you have liquid down below, we now have a habitat where organisms can live, even in the wintertime. If it was the opposite, then we would see our lakes and ponds would freeze solid from the bottom up during wintertime. Because if you have like a little pond right here and you have ice, if the water froze and became more dense, it would sink. And then the liquid on top would freeze and sink and freeze and sink. And so our lakes would freeze from the bottom up. And that doesn't happen, so that's why we continue even in the wintertime. We will have water underneath the ice, and that is a habitat for organisms to live. And then the last property of water we're going to talk about is that water has what's called high heat or high heat capacity. Now you've probably recognized that it takes a long time for water to boil. So what we mean by high heat capacity is that water can absorb a large amount of heat before it even goes up 1 degree. So like for example, if I put, let's look over here on this next page. If I put 50 joules of heat energy into water, then the water temperature is going to be at about 12 degrees Celsius. If I add 50 joules of heat to aluminum, so the same amount of heat on a piece of aluminum, that aluminum is going to measure about 55 degrees Celsius. So you can see that water can hold a lot of energy with very little temperature change. So if the temperature, again, is if we add 50 joules of energy to water, then the temperature is only at 12 degrees. That same amount is going to make aluminum get really, really hot, okay? So that's what I mean by it has high heat capacity. It can hold or absorb a lot of energy, or it requires a lot of energy before it even goes up 1 degree Celsius. That's not the case for things like your metals. So this is important to living things because we're primarily made of water, and since water temperature doesn't fluctuate, it remains very steady, then that allows us to maintain a very constant body temperature. If we took your temperature, it's probably going to be close to about 98.6 degrees. That's kind of the average for humans. And even if you run around and get hot, you're going to be able to keep that temperature at about 98.6 because you have water that can absorb all that heat energy with very little temperature change. This also creates environments or habitats that have very constant temperatures. So our lakes, our ponds, our ocean, we don't have a great fluctuation in temperature from one day to the next, which is a good thing because animals like fish, they can't survive a drastic change in temperature. A lot of people kill their goldfish when they change the water and they don't let it come back to room temperature. If you put that goldfish in a cold tank, then the goldfish is going to die. So it's really important that there's habitats that don't change in temperature a lot, and then therefore it makes a place where living organisms can survive. If you take a look at on the back here, hopefully you can recognize the different properties of water that we're diagramming here. So we can see that here we have water down here, and this is a thin tube. It looks like that tube attracted water into it, so we got some adhesion. If water moves in, it brings other water molecules with it. That's cohesion. And since water is moving upward against gravity, that's capillary action. Over here we see we have these ions and they're surrounded by water. And so that means water is dissolving them. So water is an excellent solvent, or it's the universal solvent. Over here we can see that we have solid ice is less dense than water as a liquid. And so the fact that it's less dense as a solid is another property. Over here we talked about water has high heat capacity. It can hold a lot of heat with very little temperature change. So if you add 100, water is only about 20 degrees. If you add 100 joules of heat energy to aluminum, then it's going to be well above 100. It's going to be really, really hot with that same amount of heat. And then here's a good example where we see that in this we got some water right here, and it looks like water is being made. Water is a product in this reaction, so water can participate in reactions. So make sure you know your properties of water. You can define them, you can recognize pictures of the different properties, and you can tell me how they're important to living things.